Good afternoon, and welcome to the Jewish Policy Center webinar. I am Shoshana Bryan, Senior Director of the JPC and your host. Before we go to our guest, Dr. David Wurmser, let's do our JPC commercial in short form today because we have a lot to unpack here. The JPC was established in 1985 as a 501c3 organization, providing analysis of both foreign and domestic policies. You can find us on our website, jewishpolicycenter.org. I'm sorry you have to spell it all out, but you do, jewishpolicycenter.org. There you can read our insight articles, our magazine In Focus Quarterly, and our blog In Context. You can also listen to our previous webinar programs, and there are a lot of them. The JPC supports a strong American defense capability, U.S.-Israel security cooperation, and missile defense. We support the legitimacy and security of Israel against anyone who would deny them. As an organization that sits slightly to the right of center, JPC advocates for small government, low taxes, free trade, fiscal responsibility, energy security, free speech, and intellectual diversity. Some of you have been with us since the beginning of this series of calls in early 2020. We've done China, Israel, Iran, Turkey, Russia, domestic security, education, the defense budget, and the Supreme Court, some of those things more than once. And one of my recent favorites, the Abraham Accords with Jason Greenblatt. They're all on the website. Please go take a look. Today, it is several of these things put together, and David Wurmser is the perfect guest for all of them. David Wurmser is actually the perfect guest for lots and lots of things, but today in particular, he is an expert in 4 things that are on the docket: Middle East politics, American security, Israel's security, and the energy resources off the coasts of Israel and Lebanon, which have all come together in the Israel-U.S. and Lebanon-U.S. Maritime agreements. David is a senior analyst and director of the Project on Global Anti-Semitism and U.S.-Israel Relationship at the Center for Security Policy, and he's a senior fellow at the Kohelet Policy Forum. You've read his work in our magazine, In Focus, most recently this past summer, where he wrote about the cultural foundations of Middle East regional politics. He put both the United States and Israel into their perceived roles as tribes in the region, rather than, as we think about it, countries. That's all I'm going to say about it. Strongly recommend that you go to our website and read the whole thing. It's fabulous. And what about energy? David is the executive and founding member of the Delphi Global Analysis Group, a firm specializing in geopolitical risk analysis and mitigation for infrastructure, high-tech, defense, and financial firms in the US, Japan, and India, navigating Israel. His American government service includes a senior advisory role to Vice President Cheney and one to Undersecretary of State John Bolton. Following the 9/11 attacks, he consulted to DoD on terror group networks and their interaction with states. David spent 11 years doing intelligence work for the U.S. Naval Reserve, reaching the rank of lieutenant commander. He was mobilized in 1994 during Operation Vigilant Warrior to serve on the Iraq Intelligence Task Force for DIA. He is the recipient of the task force of the Defense Meritorious Service Medal. David holds a PhD from Johns Hopkins University, and in addition to his book, Tyranny's Ally, America's Failure to Defeat Saddam Hussein, he has published extensively in major periodicals and, as I mentioned, in Focus Quarterly here at the JPC. With that, David Wurmser, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Shoshana. Well, I think the subject today that we're going to talk about is the Lebanon-Israel Maritime Agreement, which has been it was signed actually today. It was not a signature that we've become accustomed to either through Oslo or through the Jordanian-Israeli peace treaty or the Abraham Accords, where you actually have an Arab leader sitting down with an Israeli leader in an act of recognition of the other's country. What we have here is essentially an arrangement between two countries. Lebanon insists it does not recognize Israel, that it will not do anything to normalize any ties with Israel. And to make the point clear, they refused to sign in the same room as the Israelis. So right off the bat, what we see is a strange little agreement that is being touted as a great historical achievement. So I'm going to sort of parse it a bit, starting with that. This is a great historic achievement. Some of the justifications for the agreement are, well, look, Israel and Lebanon have essentially recognized each other because they put the same signature on a piece of paper. First of all, it's not quite true. The Israelis put signature to a paper with the United States, and the Lebanese have put signature to paper with the United States. But as far as the historic goes, on top of it all, we need to be clear about something. The 1949 Rhodes Agreement was such an agreement, an indirect agreement, negotiated by the United States and the island of Rhodes, and Lebanon was a participant in that and a signatory to that. And it essentially demarked the border, the ceasefire line and the border. Although with Lebanon, there wasn't a big question because the mandatory border had been marked between Britain and France long ago. So this is not an international border that was under question per se. It had been demarked already long ago. The problem with the Rhodes Agreement in other areas like Judea and Samaria, the West Bank, or on the Golan, or in the other areas, Gaza and so forth, was that there was no border there. There never was a border there. It was all part of mandatory Palestine. So the Green Line was only a ceasefire line. The Rhodes Agreements basically said the two sides will then negotiate out their final borders up between those lines up to possibly the international border. Lebanon is an international border. So there's no real question over where that line was, nor was there a real question based on convention how that line extends to sea for the first 12 kilometers, the 12 miles, the territorial waters of Israel. So there's nothing historic there. That was already set then, and frankly, it was set even before the Rhodes Agreement. Second of all, the Israelis met the same conditions, or the Lebanese and Israelis met the same conditions as now. They put their signatures to a piece of paper, didn't recognize each other, although Lebanon was committed to negotiate a final settlement in the Rhodes Agreement. It really isn't committed to that now. The third area where it's supposedly historic is, or not historic, is the fact that Israel and Lebanon already had a peace treaty. And after the Lebanon War, this was not dictated to Lebanon by Israel. It was a treaty negotiated out by the United States as the intermediary between Lebanon and Israel, that did mark out a border, established diplomatic relations, had mutual recognition, and was a treaty under international law. So there's literally no precedent this treaty sets that is so historic. So first of all, that selling point already tells us it's not quite what it's being billed as. The second thing that I think is very important is this treaty makes a big deal about deterrence, or that in some way Israel is gaining a lot of security out of this. And one of the arguments they give is that it gives them deterrence because by developing Lebanon, its economy, you essentially give them value that they would lose in a war. And as a result, for the first time, Israel has something it can hold over Lebanon's head as an instrument of deterrence. There's a number of problems with that. First of all, we just have witnessed the success of that theory with Germany and Russia over Nord Stream 2 and Nord Stream 1. The whole idea the Germans put forward over the last decade was that the deeper the interdependence between Russia and its economic advantage in selling gas to Europe, the more that will stabilize the European continent, and the more it will tame Russia, and the more it will guarantee security going forward on the European continent. And now we see that it was gas particularly that allowed Russia, especially the Nord Stream 2, allowed Russia to essentially throw away the need for gas pipelines through other areas. But most importantly, we're at war. We're in the most dangerous war in Europe we've had probably since World War II. So the theory has failed. The second problem with this deterrent theory is essentially the value is being given to the Lebanese. But the Lebanese have no agency. The Lebanese right now are occupied essentially by Syria and Iran via Syria and by Hezbollah, which is essentially an Iranian appendage. So Lebanon can want to separate. It can want to be deterred. It can want to make peace. It can want many things, but it can't do it because it's not an independent actor. This is essentially like saying, well, if America just flooded Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Poland, etc., with large amounts of aid in the Cold War, then they would have decided not to be part of the Soviet orbit. It wasn't their choice. Believe me, it wasn't their choice. It isn't Lebanon's choice either. So I don't see how you can deter against an actor that has no agency. So the real address for deterrence would have to be Iran. The second thing is, some will say, well, Iran operates through Hezbollah. Hezbollah is really the structure through which Lebanon has no agency. So therefore, if you give something that will build up Hezbollah's investment in this, that it has a reason not to sabotage this, then in essence, you are beginning to create a barrier or a fissure between Hezbollah and Iran that could lead to a unified Hezbollah Lebanese walking away from the Iranian orbit. There's so many problems with this theory as well. First of all, the idea that Hezbollah is an independent actor or could even be an independent actor from Iran is it doesn't reflect any basis in Hezbollah's history. There are Shiite factions in Lebanon, like Amal. There are Shiite leaders in Lebanon that have always been there. By the way, the peace agreement in 1984 between Israel and Lebanon, the champion of it was really the most significant Shiite politician of that time. There are Shiites in Lebanon that are actors, et cetera, et cetera. But the very creation of Hezbollah was to bring all those factions into the control of Iran. They were way too independent and way too dangerous. So the very essence, the very purpose of Hezbollah is to repress Lebanese Shiism into the Iranian orbit and not become a threat to Iran from a Shiite perspective. So the idea that Lebanon could separate from Iran, it's essentially like saying that the United States 82nd Airborne can separate from the United States. It doesn't have an independent existence. It doesn't have an independent raison d'etre. It is the instrument of Iranian power in Lebanon. And if you don't believe me, there are speeches by Hezbollah's leader, Nasrallah, who basically is arguing, and I saw a speech this morning, which I'd be happy to send to post on the website, that where he essentially says there is no Lebanon. Right now, the purpose of Hezbollah is to fight Israel. And once that war is won and Israel's destroyed, there still will not be a Lebanon, because Lebanon will become part of the larger Islamic Republic that will be led by Khomeini, and Khomeini was still alive at that point, and will eventually be led by the returned Imam, the 12th Imam from 1,300 years ago. So there was never an idea of Lebanese-ness to Hezbollah. It was always a function of the Islamic Revolution in Tehran and an agent of it. So again, Hezbollah has no agency either. It is an Iranian instrument. The other thing too that they would say is, yeah, well, but still there's an economic side here. Perhaps Iran could benefit, Hezbollah could benefit, Lebanon could benefit. Well, first of all, it disturbs me that Israel has now allowed major funding of terrorist organizations and is on this day when Iran itself is in flames, with a population of 80 some million trying to destroy their Islamic revolutionary government. On this day, the Israelis are signing an agreement that could potentially free up money to that very regime to suppress its people and to engage in such aggressive behavior as has been its custom for the last, well, since it came into being, and certainly in the last 10 years accelerated. So again, that part of the money right away disturbs me. But the second thing too is, if the idea is that over time you begin to create an independent interest in Lebanon, it would strike me then that Hezbollah, and by extension Iran, has a vested interest then in sabotaging it. Again, using a Cold War analogy, if the United States had developed these independent ties with Czechoslovakia in the Cold War, and they really threatened the possibility that Czechoslovakia could tell Russia goodbye, I would imagine that's a destabilizing action, because then the Russians would do everything they can to sabotage it, to destroy it. So it doesn't, to me, stabilize the gas question in the Eastern Mediterranean. It actually destabilizes it, because it gives Iran almost an existential reason to oppose it and to sabotage it. The other reason the Israeli defense establishment is given for this is that we were at the edge of war. There was going to be war. Well, I'm not an Israeli. I don't want to say war is good or bad, or war is never good, but there are times when wars are necessary. I'm not an Israeli, so I'm never going to say when the Israelis should go to war. But I can say this. This is probably the worst time in the world for Hezbollah to go to war, because between 4,000 and 8,000 of its fighters right now are sitting in the streets of Iran trying to suppress an uprising that could end the regime, which would destroy Hezbollah. So frankly, Hezbollah is far too preoccupied right now to throw everything it can into this war. The second thing is, and I think if this is about deterrence, then Israel has just destroyed its deterrence, because it's basically saying it's paying protection money to not be attacked. That does not speak well for the future. It should be Israel's power and Israel's threat of response that deters Hezbollah and Iran from acting against Israeli fields, not paying them protection money essentially to do so. So again, I think this undermines deterrence. So some of the core arguments here that are behind the agreement don't seem to hold up. Then we have the US-Israel security guarantee. This is another big, quote, victory of this, that for the first time, America is extending a security guarantee to Israel. We don't know the full terms of this. It isn't the first security guarantee. There is, and to this I have to give Shoshana credit, this is not my idea. There never really has been a true security guarantee of Israel's security. It's been more, in the Sinai, it's been more the monitoring guarantee, or the guarantee that the Straits of Tiran would stay open for Israeli shipping going to through the Red Sea. But there wasn't actually a guarantee, a sort of a NATO-like article guarantee of Israel's security per se. This would be the first. But the real question is, does that really secure Israel? In many ways, the intense popularity of Israel in the United States is precisely because it is seen as the type of ally we want to have. I'll lay aside all the cultural foundations for the relationship. Just on the security side, what Americans like is that Israel carries its own weight, that it does what it needs to do to defend itself. It's what strikes America's imagination. It's one of the reasons why America is so respectful of Israel in a popular level. They know Israel doesn't ask the United States to send its boys to die for it. In many ways, these security guarantees, and I have the same problem with all these attempts to get Israel, by some in the defense establishment in Israel, to get the United States to do the military or kinetic actions against Iran's nuclear program. it is very dangerous in the long run for Israel to become perceived as a strategic albatross rather than a strategic asset. And I think that an agreement where Israel's defense becomes more and more dependent on America's will, and by the way, that's also strings attached. That's also a problem that I'm not very comfortable with. But nonetheless, I think this would be the beginning of an erosion of the deep respect Americans have for Israel, precisely because Israel is now relying on the United States to defend it, where frankly, Israel could do just as well to defend itself. So I don't, the Israel-US security guarantee in this, I think, is probably one of the most problematic parts of it, in fact, because of that. So, and then finally, I'll finish with this. There's a big problem with it. Allows, the other argument put forward is, well, it allows Israel to be unharassed in its development of its own fields, because there's an agreement now. First of all, Israel's already developed many of its fields, Tamar, Leviathan, etc. It's developed these. The Iranians have threatened. They've even tried to send things. Nothing's ever happened. The defense of these fields rests in the hands of the IDF and will continue to rest in the hands of the IDF. So there's really no additional security value that this agreement gives in terms of defending or helping Israel drill and extract gas from its own fields. But it does do something that I think is problematic. And I think this goes to the larger question of Israel's gas policy, which is that Israel over the last year and a half, really 2 years, has acted in many ways to sabotage, or maybe that's too strong a word, but to really hamper its own gas development. It is, you have all these agreements with Europe about supplying gas, but gas needs to get to Europe, and it needs a transmission structure to do so. And the Israelis have no transmission structure right now. They rely on Egypt and direct pipes to Jordan, but they do not have any direct transmission structure to Europe. To really build that structure, the Israeli government has really been slow. It has de-incentivized it by sabotage. It quite literally rejected a UAE offer to take pipes from the Gulf through Israel to the Mediterranean and create a gas hub in Israel. The Israelis seem to prefer to use Egypt as a gas hub rather than itself. And I think strategically, this is very dangerous, and it doesn't help Israel. It pushes UAE to go through Egypt rather than Israel. Now they're trying to develop the Gaza gas fields, which will go through Egypt, and money for Hamas. So looking south, the whole thing looks weird. So looking north toward Lebanon, what exactly is Israel doing? Well, here, one thing that was always helping Israel, it's sad. I mean, Lebanon, it's sad for Lebanon, but Lebanon couldn't get its act together and its gas couldn't flow. So there was no competition from Lebanon. And now all of a sudden, Israel has opened up Lebanon as a competitor to itself. And it's a very dangerous situation because there will be pipes that will eventually come from the Persian Gulf going out to the Mediterranean in a gas hub. And what Israel has done is just unlocked the ability of Qatar using Total and gas pipelines through certain other areas to go through Lebanon out to the Mediterranean. The Turks are keen on this. Because it would take the pipes then through Turkey rather than through Cyprus or Greek waters. So in many ways, Israel has once again acted in a way that undermines its ability to become a gas hub in the long run. It wouldn't be right for Israel to sabotage Lebanon, but it shouldn't fall over itself to help them either, which is what they've done. So I think I've talked enough. I'd rather leave for questions now, if it's all okay.
And we have questions, David. They're not happy questions because you have not given us a happy picture for the United States, for Israel, and really not even for Lebanon. One thing that you did mention, a couple of people responded to some things that you said, that financial support from the US and Israel through this mechanism can actually cause Hezbollah to intervene more in Lebanese politics and destroy this thing for its own reason. Isn't that sort of what happened in Ukraine? That the Russians perceived Ukraine moving more toward NATO, wanting to be more toward the United States, and actually that sort of pushed a button for the Russians. So are we watching a repeat?
Yeah, I mean, there's only two ways you can look at an agreement. One is it is going to fund the right Lebanese and create an incentive for them to bolt, at which point, why wouldn't Hezbollah and Iran sabotage it? I mean, it would be a vital interest for them to sabotage it. And yes, that is essentially what we saw with Ukraine. But then the second side is, oh no, they actually get the money. But then let's be realistic here. Lebanon, is the Lebanese gas is funding Hezbollah and Iran. Does Israel really want to unlock these funds? I mean, it's out there campaigning day and night not to lift sanctions on Iran. Well, this would unlock a lot of money for Iran. I don't see, the logic is a hybrid that contradicts itself. And therein lies, again, if this is really a genuine reflection of the consideration that the defense establishment in Israel gave to justify the agreement to itself, then there needs to be a very serious examination of the reigning concepts, or as the Israelis would call it, conceptia, that governs the defense establishment in Israel, because we know what these locked in stone conceptions in Israel's defense establishment lead to. And it's not a happy picture.
So along the same lines, we've also seen the Biden administration and previously the Obama administration, not Trump in the middle, seem to believe that if you offer money to unhappy players like the Palestinian Authority, or lift sanctions from Iran, or money for Lebanon, Hezbollah, any way you want to split that hair, they will behave in a way that's more responsible and more peaceful and safer for the world. That appears to be their view. Have you ever found that to be true?
No.
Okay.
The long answer is no.
Yeah.
I cannot think of a historical circumstance in the Middle East where economics trumped politics, identity, or ideology. Not one. And I remember arguing. I remember arguing with the Israeli government in 2011 when Israel had developed all this gas, and it was still importing a lot of gas from Egypt at the time. We forget that Israel actually imported gas from Egypt between 2005 and about 2012. And it was 2010, 2011. And I had an argument with generally people who are very sharp and get it in the Israeli government, who argued very forcefully that Egypt will never cut off its gas to Israel because there's too much of an economic, Egypt's economy depends on it at that point. The hard revenue that Israel was giving Egypt was so essential to the Egyptian economy, no Egyptian government could contemplate cutting off that gas trade. And within months, the gas trade was cut off. We've seen this again and again even with Turkey, which is part of NATO and sort of has one foot in Europe. When it comes to Israel, when it comes to issues in the Middle East, I have seen them consistently damage their economic interests in order to pursue an ideological agenda. And then we have the Palestinian Authority, Lebanon. I mean, Lebanon's economic interest ultimately is to return to what it was in the 60s, which was sort of a banking, financial center, distribution center. It was all sorts of things. But it wasn't, by the way, that's another thing is if you think that you're stabilizing a country by making it entirely dependent on gas, that's called the Dutch disease syndrome. And that's not a happy picture for any country that ever went down that road. It's precisely why the Norwegians set up a sovereign wealth fund that had a law that said that sovereign wealth fund is governed by a law that says not a cent from the gas revenue or the oil revenue that they've got, that they put into that fund, can be spent in Norway, because they were afraid Dutch disease would kick in, which is two things. One is that the entire budget of the country then becomes dependent on this resource, which is transient. And then industry is essentially distorted and hampered because nobody does anything because they're all living off the government. So it distorts the economy and makes the entire country dependent on government handouts. So is this really a foundation for Lebanese independence in the long run? Or is this yet another way in which you're sort of baking into Lebanon's economic situation the dependence down the road and collapse? But anyway, the bottom line of what you're asking, I have never seen economics drive politics in the Middle East, ever.
Okay.
Except in Israel.
Well, maybe that's what happens when you become a first world democratic country. And the economics of the thing do have an impact because your citizens are part of your responsibility. Hezbollah does not take any responsibility for the health and welfare of Lebanese citizens. And really, neither does the PA and neither does Iran. So maybe that says something good about Israel at the end of the day.
Yeah.
But if all of these things are in fact guaranteed by military means, by security programming, how well do you think Israel is able to protect the natural gas assets by itself? I have some doubts that the US will help them do it. So how do you see Israel's ability to defend its assets?
Well, first of all, whatever capability Israel had before this agreement, it has now, and vice versa. Whatever capability it has now, it had before the agreement. I don't think there's a single Israeli who's confident that this piece of paper is going to defend their fields. In the end, it's the IDF. And that was, again, existent before, it'll be existent after. I wouldn't be surprised if there aren't attempts to probe and see how far Hezbollah can go in testing the lines, which, by the way, are themselves also an issue. From what we understand, it's not a clear line. It's certainly not one accepted by the Lebanese side as the final line, which means everything still is subject to revanchism.
I'm going to ask you about that in a minute.
Yeah, the problem is we don't know exactly the details of it all, but at any rate, the point is the idea. Now, with the United States, first of all, the United States right now is stretched thin. We have China to worry about. We're going to have a situation where America simply does not have the sort of assets to have such a heavy footprint in the Eastern Mediterranean. I would say the whole direction of American-Israeli relations should be the exact opposite of where they're headed. Instead of making Israel more dependent on the United States needs allies that will help protect its interests in the region for it while it's in a period of either military stress, which we may be very soon with China and so forth, or a period in which we're introverted, which we're entering into, because however one thinks of American politics, this certainly will be a time of defining American politics in the next decade, and Americans will be consumed with themselves, and they have to be. They have to sort out big questions, or whether it's a time of economic stress in America where we have to pull back on military spending. All those things suggest that Israel or that America will value most those allies who actually help it, are force multipliers for American presence somewhere, not the opposite. Those who sort of pull back and say, America, you take care of this for us. So I think the whole direction is reverse of what it should be. But that said, I don't think America is in a strong position to guarantee the Eastern Mediterranean at this point, simply because we have an unresolved circumstance in Europe, and we have a very dangerous and unresolved circumstance in Asia. And God knows whatever else may happen with Latin America, so many countries turning hostile and so forth. I wouldn't count on America. And then the history is not good. Israel doesn't govern the sort of guarantee automatic response that other nations have enjoyed from American security. So I think if the Israelis are counting on the American military or Navy to defend its fields, I think they will at some point in the future be very sorely surprised for them, and badly.
I will say they're probably better off than the Afghans. We gave them security
Yeah,
guarantees as well, and that didn't work out very well for the Afghans. I think the Israelis would do better. But I'm going to stretch you here just a little bit, but I know you can go there. Israel entered CENTCOM, and it seems to me, and I have to admit, I wasn't a huge fan at the time because I was concerned that the United States was going to use that as an excuse to withdraw from the Red Sea and from that area and kind of leave things to Israel. But I think the arrangement's been working extremely well for the Israelis and for the United States. But that's what it is. I mean, it works down there. It doesn't work in the Mediterranean. It works where it works. I think the Israel entry into CENTCOM reinforced the idea that Israel defends its interests, whereas this agreement undermines that thought. You know, what is Israel now going to require from the United States in the Red Sea? I mean,
by the way, I think that's one of the foundations, not only of the entry into CENTCOM, but the Abraham Accords, was the idea that Israel is a regional power that defends itself, defends its interests, and that those nations who share those interests with Israel benefit greatly from having those ties with Israel, and that the dependence on the United States, the problem that these countries, and we see it now with Saudi Arabia, the problem many countries in the region have is they don't trust the United States because they've been abandoned before, whether it's Mubarak in Egypt or whether it's the Saudis feeling it now. They don't trust the United States right now. So precisely because they saw Israel as an independent actor that said no to the United States when it violated its fundamental interests. And I would go as far as to say that Netanyahu's speech to the US Congress on the original Iran deal, the JCPOA, speaking out against it, did a lot to convince the people in the region that Israel was not just an American minion that could not be counted on any more than the United States. It was seen to be a powerful, independent actor that pursued its interests. So in many ways, the entry into the Abraham Accords is a validation. So again, this agreement, I think, undermines that perception. It once again looks like, you know, I'm as patriotic as anybody about America. I want America to be strong. But I think that at this point, for Israel to depend on the United States sends the wrong signal to the region that Israel is simply, essentially, what they always thought it was, which is no more than an appendage of the United States defense establishment.
so then, looking back at the countries involved in this agreement, Lebanon and Israel, and the United States, everybody's having an election. So the Lebanese are going to have a new president in a couple of weeks, apparently, maybe. The Israelis are having an election on November 1st. We're having a midterm election on November 8th, which could conceivably change the balances of power between the legislative and the executive branch. If this thing doesn't work out, if this agreement doesn't work out, what are the mechanisms, or are there, for, let's say that Likud takes power in Israel? Let's say that Republicans take over the House and the Senate to get rid of this thing. Is this a shaky agreement by its nature? It's shaky in Lebanon. We already know that because of the constellation of forces. Could either of the other two get out?
Yeah, look, Lebanon, unless you deal with the problem of Hezbollah, Lebanon doesn't exist.
Right.
It's a fiction. It is a minion of Syria and Hezbollah, and by extension, Iran. Until that problem's dealt with, and trying to, as we went through, trying to entice them, seduce them out, won't work. Until those problems are dealt with, there is no independent Lebanon. So Lebanese elections, and we've had this going back to 2006, 5. The elections then, we were hoping that they would, after the March movements and so forth, that we would have these independent movements in Lebanon that kicked the Syrians out. We thought, oh, now's the time where they're going to vote against Hezbollah and throw them out. The problem was Hezbollah had guns, and Hezbollah managed and basically ensured those elections would go right. So the elections became actually a delegitimizer of those who oppose Hezbollah because they won. I think you're going to see the same here in Lebanon, and that sort of takes care of Lebanon. As far as Israel goes, I have not seen even a micro shift in Israeli polls because of this. Not one. I mean, not one 0.001% has shifted. Israel's elections are going to be determined by other factors. It's amazing how this has had no impact whatsoever, because I think the Israelis don't feel it as real. They felt the Abraham Accords. There was a fever in Israel with the Abraham Accords. It was a little bit less than I would have expected, but it was still there. There's no fever. There's no Lebanon fever in Israel. There's no Maritime Agreement fever. I think Israelis kind of, I mean, I've heard one or two people call it sort of the Maritime Oslo Agreement, which was destined to fail. So I don't think that that's going to politically help. The opposite. I think there's some things in it that may hurt. So far, it hasn't shown up. But first of all, if there's any challenge or any violence, surely it will show the Israelis that this was a non-agreement. But the second thing is that it gets into the weeds of Israeli politics. But there's a whole legal side to this agreement, which Eugene Kantorovich has been writing about a lot. That there's some very serious problems legally with this because it wasn't brought to the Knesset, to the parliament, for approval. Sovereign Israeli territory was surrendered. No, not only the economic zone. The maritime line up to 12 miles out is your sovereign territory. It's liquid, but it's sovereign. Israel gave it up, and it did not go to the Knesset, to the parliament, to approve it. Eugene Kantorovich had a conversation with the Attorney General's office, and from what I understand, their argument was because there are no citizens that live there. There's no population, so therefore the parliament, as the voice of the people, doesn't actually have a role here because it's depopulated. What's so serious about that is essentially sets the precedent for giving up parts of the Negev desert to Egypt, to the PLO, to whoever, without ever bringing it for parliamentary approval. So the legal aspects are great. I think that this sense of a defense establishment, legal sorority or fraternity governing Israel has a potential, hasn't yet, but has a potential to strike that Israeli populist chord, which is still bristling at the idea of those two establishments being impervious to the really tremendous economic, demographic, cultural changes that Israel's had over the last 50 years. Those are still dinosaurs of the old system, and the Israelis feel it. And if this somehow gets wrapped up in that question, it could have a political impact negatively for the government.
But probably not between now and November 1st.
Probably not. I
So
think
now
the Biden administration wanted its Abraham Accords, both for itself and for the Israeli government. If that was their calculation, they just turned up a bunch of twos. No aces, no kings, queens, or anything. Just a bunch of twos.
And do you have any comment on the U.S. position in this? I mean, there are plenty of people on the Hill who are not happy with it.
Well, I mean, sooner or later, Americans are going to ask, how seriously is Israel trying to choke funding for Hezbollah and Iran if Israel unlocks funding for Hezbollah and Iran through this agreement? I'm sure there's going to be challenges to that. The second thing is you have to look at the player who's been enriched by this, Total. Total right now is under investigation for bribes and and operating illegally in places like Iran. So I think that this could win Israel an investigation on the Hill eventually. So I think it really has to be careful how it involves itself with stuff like this. But the second thing is, once again, Israel's popularity is anchored to the respect that Israel governs in American society. Washington follows the American people. It's why the State Department is never pro-Israeli, because it doesn't believe it answers to the American people. But the more you get toward a representative, namely the president is elected, then the senators are elected, and then the House is elected, Congress being a much more sensitive institution to public opinion, the more you go there, the more pro-Israeli they become, because Americans are pro-Israeli. And that's the real foundation of support for Israel, is that public perception, not some understanding in the corridors of power in Washington. And this undermines the foundations of that support. So no, I think in the long run, it hurts Israeli-American relations. It may help, Biden and some people, President Biden, be more comfortable with Israel in the next few weeks, but it won't buy Israel any real support or any real gains in the near future.
So David, at the end of a very depressing program, people
Sorry.
that watch it, that's okay. People that watch us periodically know that I like to end on an optimistic note. It just feels right to me. And many days we have that because the program's optimistic. And so the end is optimistic. Do you have an optimistic note for us to go out on, or are we just going to go sulk all the way through the afternoon?
Well, no, half of the stuff I said isn't going to happen. I mean, what you saw with
I like that one.
yeah. I mean, what you see is that half the stuff, for example, Lebanon, I'd be very surprised if that field is ultimately developed properly. And that there will be stuff found there. By the way, one thing, not to be too negative, we also don't know what was under the water Israel gave up. There could be another field there. So when Israel says we didn't really give up anything, we don't know that. They might have given up a monster field. But anyway, that aside, I'm dubious that this agreement will ever really last. I'm not sure that we will look at this any differently than we now look at the Lebanon-Israel peace treaty, which is nobody even remembers it was. So I think Israel will essentially proceed the way it's been proceeding. Its gas will develop. Lebanon will not proceed the way it's not proceeded. And it will probably have great difficulty truly competing with Israel as a hub. My bet is that at the end of the day, the Israelis finally begin to realize the strategic value of their situation, which is more the geography than the gas, which is they can be the hub, not only for their own gas, but for regional gas coming from the UAE and Bahrain and Saudi Arabia going out to Europe. But that then makes it also a Central American interest to make sure that that is a strong structure, which means, again, that Israel has to remain very, very strong. So I see actually in the long run, despite the missteps of the Israeli government, the historical record is the Israeli government ultimately then does the right thing after it does many of the wrong things. And I think in this case, if we're sitting here in 10 years, I'd be willing to bet Israel will be a gas hub. It will be defending itself, and it won't allow this deterioration in American interests to happen, because at the end of the day, I think the Israeli people, I mentioned about the American people, I think the Israeli people are becoming more skeptical of international guarantees and more understanding how much their defense ultimately still rests on their defense. So I think in the long run, and then finally, Israel is a dynamic country. It is going to see a lot of immigration. Its economy is going to boom. It's booming already. It's becoming a global economic center of innovation that is an international interest, rather than much like after World War II, you had certain areas of the world that were vital strategic interests. So I think in the end of the day, Israel's position is going to be very strong. But it has done everything it can in the last year or two or three to really undermine itself in this. So reality will win out. Reality will win out.
I'll take that as a positive ending.
Yes.
And thank you very much
Sure.
for enlightening us, because a lot of people have said a lot of things about this agreement, and I think it was too much process, and I appreciate that you've broken it down into specific parts that we can understand,
Sure.
and we can then follow. So David Wurmser, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Everyone else, come back next week. Thank you.
Thank you.